What did I read last week? Do-do-do-do. What did Comics Kid 2099 read last week? Last week, I read a few Superman books and a Justice League book. The first Superman book I'll be talking about is Superman vs. Zod. I've read one of these books that's kind of like this before. It was a book about Nightwing and Flamebird, the pre-crisis Nightwing and Flamebird, just different stories that were unconnected with each other, and really the only through line throughout that entire trade was that all of the stories had something to do with Nightwing and Flamebird from the city of Kandor. And this is kind of similar. It's a whole bunch of stories that are all unconnected, and the only through line here is that General Zod is in all these stories. Except that General Zod isn't in this book as much as you would think from the cover. There are really very few General Zod stories here. There's one that is a Superboy story, and it is the first mention of General Zod. He shows up very briefly in a flashback, and that is the first appearance of the Phantom Zone. And then the next story is a Superman story from the 70s where Faora has escaped from the Phantom Zone, and that's part of a two-parter. We don't get to see the other part, and General Zod is barely in that issue also. And then in some of the other stories, General Zod is a little bit more present. There's one that is the last issue of DC Comics Presents. It was immediately before the John Byrne relaunch of Man of Steel, and in that, General Zod is there, but he's, again, not featured very heavily. He's in a couple of pages. Really, this could have been called Superman and the Phantom Zone, and it would have made a little bit more sense. General Zod is only in about half of these issues featured very heavily. The last issue here takes place around the time of New Krypton, I believe. It was right after Infinite Crisis, I believe, where Jeff Johns and Richard Donner, very briefly, they had kind of revamped Superman a little bit, introduced Zod and Faora, or Ursa, I don't remember what her name was at that time, introduced their son, who eventually became Chris Kent. So this book is good. I enjoyed it, but if you're looking for a whole bunch of really awesome Superman versus Zod showdowns, this is not the book for you, because there's not a whole lot of that here. There is only one post-crisis issue in this book, which this cover is a little bit misleading because this doesn't even happen in the book. The one post-crisis issue here takes place entirely on Krypton and doesn't have Superman in it at all, and so, or he's in it as a baby. But there aren't a whole lot of Zod versus Superman issues here. All the other issues here are from pre-Crisis on Infinite Earths, and several of them don't even have Zod in them as a major player. So if you're looking for a whole lot of Zod stuff, this is a little bit misleading. Like I said, this really could have been called Superman and the Phantom Zone. The next book that I will be talking about is from Post-Crisis. This is Superman the Man of Steel Volume 5. I do not have Volumes 3 or 4 of this series. If you remember last year when I did my 365-day graphic novel review challenge, I said that I wasn't a huge fan of John Byrne's relaunch of Superman from the mid-'80s, and that still holds true. I'm still not a huge fan of what he was doing early on, but once you get past the origin stuff, once you're in the status quo and you have Superman in Metropolis and it's just normal Superman stories, I like it quite a bit more. This is okay. There's some fun stories here. There's one really dumb story. It's the one where one of Darkseid's former minions, he mind controls Superman and Big Barda into putting on a show for him, and he's going to try and make a sex tape out of it. It's about as dumb as it sounds. You've probably heard of that issue before. That is a two-parter here. We get some other stuff here. We find out that Maggie Sawyer has a daughter. I did not know that. I would love to see that character show up again. I would love to see Maggie Sawyer's relationship with her daughter be referenced in some way. I have no idea if that character still exists in the current DCU with the landscape the way it is. Maggie Sawyer is, of course, a lesbian, and so I'm not sure if her daughter has been retconned to no longer exist. Apparently, here, it wasn't quite established that Maggie was a lesbian, or if they knew that she was, they weren't quite showing their hand just yet at this point. Maybe they were thinking that she was bisexual. I'm not really sure, but her daughter has run away at this point, and she does not have custody of the daughter, but she is very worried about her daughter, and I really like that. I would like to have seen more done with that relationship between Maggie and her daughter, where she doesn't have a great relationship with her daughter because her ex-husband has full custody, and then she's also not the woman that her daughter thought she knew, because her daughter doesn't know that her mom is a lesbian. When she finds out, maybe that's hard for her daughter to deal with, or maybe it's not. Maybe that's a non-issue, but then the daughter still doesn't like her mom. I would love to have seen more be done with that. This was the first and only time that I've ever seen Maggie Sawyer's daughter even referenced. But some pretty okay stories here, and then a couple of kind of silly ones, but overall, I like this one quite a bit. It's pretty good, and if you really like John Byrne's origin stuff from Man of Steel Volume 1, you will probably like this book. And then if you're like me and you don't really care for the origin stuff, you may like this anyway. I like this one quite a bit anyway, even though I didn't like the material in the first couple of volumes of Byrne's Man of Steel run. And then the next book that I'll be talking about is Superman, The Power Within. This is a collection of stories drawn by Curt Swan, who was a pre-Crisis Superman artist, and these issues are pretty good. I really like Curt Swan's art. For some reason, I had it in mind that he was kind of an old school artist, and I guess he was. I don't believe he's alive anymore, but I guess he was kind of that old school style. But his style did update quite nicely for the post-Crisis universe, because all these stories are set after Crisis on Infinite Earths, but his style still works very nicely for these stories. About half of this book is from the time period when Action Comics was a weekly series, and I don't really care for the way they did Action Comics weekly. The way they would do it, they would have like 5 or 6 weekly features in Action Comics, and each feature would have about 2 pages. So, for example, we're just going to open up to a random page here. This would be all that you would get in that particular issue of Action Comics Weekly. All of this page, and then all of this page here. And the pacing is a little difficult to get used to. Right when things start to get moving, okay, time to go on to the next issue, and then you have to stop everything and then pick everything back up the next week. I wish they hadn't done it that way. If it was me, if someone came up to me and said, we want to turn Action Comics into a weekly comic, how do you think that we should do it? I would have said, okay, this week we're going to have Deadman. Remember Deadman? He was created by Neil Adams in the late 60s, early 70s. We'll bring him back for one issue. We'll bring back Neil Adams. We'll have him draw Deadman for one issue. And he can take as long as he wants because he's not doing a weekly comic book series or even a monthly comic book series. He can take as long as he wants to do that one issue of Deadman. And then the next issue, let's bring back Hawk and Dove. Let's have Steve Ditko do a Hawk and Dove reunion or something like that. And then the next issue, let's do Rip Hunter, or let's do, I don't know, Booster Gold. Let's have all these characters who don't have their own monthly feature, and we'll have them rotate in and out in this weekly feature. And then if people don't like Deadman, then you can bring in the Demon, or you can bring in John Constantine, or whatever. I don't think John Constantine had his own comic at this time, but if he did, that's beside the point. You can bring in different characters and different creative teams to work on a character for an issue, and you have a whole bunch of these guys in rotation so that you never have to worry about, okay, we're late, we need to get this comic out next week. And that way, the pacing is not interrupted every 2 pages like it was here. It was a little difficult getting through this story, but ignoring the pacing, I thought the premise of the story was pretty interesting. Basically, there is a cult of people who worship Superman, and they believe that worshiping Superman has given them superpowers. And that was a very interesting premise. You've got Clark Kent going around with this guy who worships Superman, and he keeps trying to convince this guy, hey, Superman is not a god. He keeps trying to convince him that as Clark Kent and as Superman. And there's several times where they get caught in some kind of situation, and he thinks, you know, I could turn into Superman here, but then this guy is going to think that him praying to Superman is actually working, and I can't have him thinking that Superman is a god, so I'm going to have to figure out some way to do this secretly without using my powers. And that was very interesting. And the way it ends at the end of the story is a little weird. There's a character who comes in, and it's revealed that this character is responsible for all the stuff that's going on here. It seems a little inconsistent with that character's MO, but I guess they needed a way to solve that story and get it wrapped up a little bit. So that was a little weird, but I'm willing to let it go. And then we get a few issues here featuring a new character called Sinbad. The character's name is actually Davoud. He is a Middle Eastern character from, I believe, the fictional continent or the fictional country of Korak, I believe was what it was called. It is a country in DC Comics, and sometime before the events of this book, Superman, he went and destroyed the Koraki military. And then in this issue, we've got this guy, as a result of the invasion storyline, where a whole bunch of characters in the DC universe got metahuman superpowers, he now has telekinesis. And then meanwhile, Lex Luthor, he is trying to get a hold of this alien artifact that this boy accidentally comes in contact with, and then it expands on his powers, it strengthens his powers, and this kid, he's kind of angry at Superman. He thinks that Superman is out to kill all the people of Karak. I believe that's the name of the country. I hope I'm not mistaken there. And anyway, this kid, he's kind of antagonistic towards Superman, and from his point of view, he has a right to be antagonistic because he thinks that Superman is out to destroy his country and his way of life. And Superman, meanwhile, he thought he was doing the right thing. He thought he was doing what needed to be done, and now he realizes that his actions have had negative consequences here in America. And I like that as a reason why Superman Superman doesn't go around taking the law into his own hands, why he mostly just focuses on Brainiac and Titano and Parasite and stuff like that, because if he tries to go and end world hunger, then it's going to backfire on him some way. That was something that we saw him try to solve in one of those Paul Dini, Alex Ross one-shot issues. So if he goes and tries to dismantle a tyrannical country's military infrastructure, it's going to backfire on him, and he realizes he needs to let humanity deal with these issues on their own, and they shouldn't have Superman try to fix everything for them. I like this as an explanation for why Superman doesn't do... Oh, sorry, wow. Why Superman doesn't do that sort of thing. Also, the coloration of Dawood and his family is a little weird. He's a Middle Eastern, but every page, they color him with the color gray. There he is, right there on that page. I thought that was a little strange. He's Middle Eastern. You have access to the color brown. Just color him brown. But that's something I guess that they did back then. If this comic came out even 10 years later, in the mid-90s instead of the mid-80s, I have a feeling that they would have colored him a little bit more realistically. But that was something that kept taking me out every time I saw him and his family. But I am curious if this character ever came back, or if they just didn't deal with this character again. He somewhat racistly has the name Sinbad as his superhero name, and at first I was thinking, at one point his younger brother actually says, hey, you could be like Sinbad, you could go around fighting monsters, and I thought, okay, it's a little bit corny, that name, but his younger brother is giving him that name, that makes sense. But then later, separately, Lex Luthor is calling the cops and saying that this guy Dawood came and robbed him, and that didn't actually happen. Lex Luthor is just trying to frame this guy, and he says, yeah, he called himself Sinbad, and I was thinking, okay, really, two separate people are both calling him Sinbad? I would have been okay with it if his younger brother gave him the name and he thought, hey, that's not a bad name. I would have been fine with that, but then when Lex Luthor separately is also calling him Sinbad, that's a little bit much. And also, come on, he can't come up with a better name than Sinbad. Everyone in the world, the first thing they're going to think of when they think of the Middle East is either, as they said in this book, it's either Sinbad or people flying into buildings. And that's a little bit shocking that they were mentioning that in the mid-80s, because this is a good 25 years before 9/11, when most people were thinking of that sort of thing. Whenever you would tell them about the Middle East, a lot of people, unfortunately, they would kind of instantly think of 9/11. But they mentioned that here. And I do wish that they had done a little bit of a better job of trying to portray this culture with this family. They don't make these characters bad guys. They kind of don't trust Superman, and rightly so. But these guys are not bad guys. I just wish they had done a little bit of a better job of portraying this family and their culture than what they did. But overall, I like this book also. I thought it was good. The Action Comics Weekly stuff is a little weaker than the rest of the stuff, but it's not bad once you're able to get past the pacing there. And then I did read one Justice League book. This is Justice League Gods and Monsters. This is a tie-in to that animated movie that came out a few years ago, and this is a 3-issue miniseries as well as 3 one-shot issues, and each one-shot focuses on one of the trinity of this alternate universe. Kirk Langstrom, who is the Batman, this guy Hernan something, who is Superman, and then Becca of the New Gods, she is Wonder Woman. And then the 3-issue miniseries here, it kind of focuses on how they became the Justice League and how they started working together. And I like this book quite a bit. It is a little bit inconsistent with the movie, but I'm okay with that. I'm able to look at this book as its own thing, and then look at the movie as its own thing, and then look at those 3 animated shorts as their own thing. But this is a little bit inconsistent with those. Specifically, the character of Superman, he is portrayed very differently here than he was in the movie and in the animated short. In those, I got the feeling that he was a darker version of Superman. He was not the same Kal-El that we know on the other world, but in fact he's not even Kal-El at all. He's not Jor-El's son at all. But he was not a barbaric character. Here, he's very wild, and he's got a rage inside him that I didn't see in the animated movie or that short. In those, I felt like he had a very calculated, calm approach to doing what he did. He would kill people, he would kill bad guys whenever the need called for it, but he wasn't just going around ripping heads off and screaming about it. And I feel like that's something that this guy would do. He's very barbaric. In a lot of ways, he reminds me of Conan the Barbarian more than he does the son of General Zod. I feel like they didn't quite have a good handle on his character here, and I don't know if these issues were done several months before they started working on the animated movie and the animated shorts, or if this was done several months after they had already finished those. I'm not sure, but it feels like an entirely different person who hadn't seen the animated movie or the shorts was working on this. And that's weird because Bruce Timm's name is on the cover here, and he was involved in the animated movie and I believe the animated shorts. So it's a little strange that this character feels so inconsistent inconsistent here and there, but I still like this book quite a bit. I really like the backstory for some of these characters. I like getting to see more of Superman's backstory here, because in the animated movie, we do get to see that baby Hernan does land in Mexico, but we don't really get to see how that affects him as a person, how that changes who this Superman is versus how he would have been if he had landed in Smallville and was adopted by the Kents. We don't really get to see much of how that changed him as a person. We just get to see that he is a different person. Here, we get to see a little bit of his backstory and how his life was very rough growing up, and even worse than Superman's life growing up when he was in Smallville. And I like that quite a bit, and I like the way it transforms him as a character throughout that issue. It's just that by the end of that issue, he does not resemble the character from the animated movie or the animated shorts. And ultimately, like I said, I'm okay with that because I did enjoy this book so much, and I enjoyed the movie and the animated shorts for the most part. I enjoyed one or two of the animated shorts. But anyway, this does give us different looks at these characters, and the one thing that I didn't like about it is that once you get into the 3-issue miniseries where we get to see these three join forces and become the Justice League, once we see that, the whole thing is narrated by Lois Lane, who is one of the most insufferable characters in all of fiction, at least this particular version of Lois is. Normally, I like Lois in the main DC universe, but this particular version of Lois is very insufferable, very difficult to swallow. She is not an easy character to want to be around. She's constantly talking about how the Justice League are evil and how they are a power that is unchecked and they're going to destroy the entire planet someday. And she's only half right, because these characters, they are a little bit more tyrannical than their main DC Universe counterparts. Superman especially, he's going around saying, you know, I'm going to kill whoever I need to kill in order to protect everyone else. But then at the same time, he's kind of walking around pulling his pants up, acting like he's the big man on campus and that nobody can do anything to stop him. So she's half right, but then a lot of times she is speculating on stuff that's going on with the Justice League, stuff that she wasn't even there for, and she's allegedly a news reporter. Instead of working for an actual newspaper, she works for, it's like DLYPLNT.NWZ or something like that. It's kind of like a blog site, I guess, except in the animated movie, she actually worked for what seemed like a real newspaper, but here it doesn't seem like she does. But anyway, she's doing a lot of speculating, which is definitely not something that a normal news reporter would do. She's saying stuff like, I can only assume that Superman manipulated Wonder Woman into doing this thing, when in actuality, as we're seeing these events play out, it was the other way around. It was Wonder Woman kind of manipulating Superman into doing something. And there's a lot of stuff like that where the Justice League is risking their lives to save people, and then she's over here saying they're probably just fattening us up so that they can rule over us like the evil people that they are. And I just want to stop seeing Lois Lane talk about what's going on here. She doesn't even actually show her face here, except for like one or two panels where we see her on the TV. She's not an actual character who is acting in these events and is actually doing stuff to affect the story here. So I really don't want to see her commenting on all of this stuff, especially when she is so insufferable. And we get to see that these Justice League characters, this particular version of the Justice League, they are a lot more complicated than what she is trying to make them sound like. They're not just evil mustache-twirling people who want to rule the planet. They're a little bit more complicated than that. Yes, they are darker than our version of the Justice League, but they are not just evil people who want to rule the world. There's a little bit of good in them and a little bit of bad in them, and I like that. And I don't like seeing Lois Lane constantly talk about how evil they are and how they're trying to rule the world. That was a little frustrating. But overall, I really like this book. Overall, I liked all these books that I talked about this week. They all had some issues, but overall, I enjoyed all of them. And that is what I read this week. There were some other things that I read that I didn't finish reading, so I won't talk about them in this video. But next Sunday, you will see me do another video where I will be talking about some things that I read for this coming week. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day, and I will see you later. Have a good one.